Thanks to the Hildebrand Project and the Willard Institute and Westmont for convening this symposium. It's been a delight. Great conversation, great to get to know everyone. I'm going to start in a kind of an unusual way. In reading through my paper again, I realized there was some material in the abstract that isn't as clearly put in the paper. So I'm going to read the abstract, and then I'm going to read the paper because I think it will help you keep the thesis more firmly in mind. There wasn't time to fix that problem, but this is a half measure. Dallas Willard observed that moral knowledge is now elusive and rarely publicly recognized in the West. He was at least partially correct. An earlier broadly Judeo-Christian public morality was and is lost. However, this former public moral knowledge has been largely replaced by a new one, variously called neoliberalism and meritocratic culture. The bulk of Willard's book is devoted to showing that the loss of the former moral knowledge wasn't due to the merits of philosophical argument, and he suggests that the explanation for how this came about would be sociocultural. The work of this paper is to provide a sociocultural explanation, and in so doing, identify a new candidate for a public moral knowledge. As I will argue, the social and economic changes distinctive of modernity appear to provide an adequate explanation of the disappearance of moral knowledge, and do so in a way that locates the phenomenon in the pervasive phenomenology of modern life, an influence operating on nearly everyone living in the West. Through a process I will describe, urbanization, pluralism, and liberalism interact to constantly refocus our attention on utility and power and away from genuine, or at least traditionally Judeo-Christian moral bases. The result is that fundamental goods and duties become harder to notice, while merely instrumentally valuable phenomena appear more salient. Genuine knowledge of morality wanes, while agreement on instrumental goods grows, and these instrumental goods are mistaken as fundamental. An older moral knowledge is replaced by something new. Once upon a time, an airplane crashed in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a small island. When the survivors came to their senses, they tried to use the airplane's radio to call for help. They found it was destroyed, so they gathered together to discuss what they should do. Everyone agreed that they needed to collect resources to stay alive while they worked toward being rescued. But they couldn't agree on the best approach to being rescued. Some said they needed to build a signal fire and make sure it constantly burned. They had probably read Lord of the Flies at some point. Others said this was too much of a drain on the small island's resources, and instead they advocated for trying to rebuild the airplane's radio. Still others said there wasn't enough resources to support them for very long on the island, and so they needed to begin building an escape raft to try to float to a better island or into a shipping lane where they could be rescued. So they split into various camps. The fire camp spent all their free time collecting driftwood and drying seaweed to use for fuel. The radio camp spent all their time poring over the operator manuals for the airplane and tinkering with the radio parts. The raft camp spent all of their time cutting down trees and collecting buoyant material from the wreckage to use in making a raft. Those in the camp spent most of their time with the camp that they identified with, but there was contact between the camps. Each camp soon realized the essential value of fish hooks, and each had someone who spent all of his time laboriously making them out of metal scraps from the wreckage. And because the fish hooks were so valuable, they eventually became a form of currency between individuals and between camps. You might trade 2 fish hooks for an old shirt or 20 for a knife. Years passed, and eventually children were born on the island who had never known life elsewhere. These children were inculcated into the traditions of the camps. Some learned the ritual of firekeeping, others the sacred project of radio building, and others the eschatological raft voyage. The elders of each camp explained to their children that the point of the daily activities on the island, collecting fish hooks, gathering water, repairing thatching on the huts, was to keep them alive so they could continue their projects of escape and rescue. However, in their day-to-day life with the other children from the other camps, these traditions couldn't maintain central focus. The children came from rival camps, and so their makeshift school tended to shy away from directly engaging with the traditions. Nothing would be accomplished if they spent all their time arguing. Instead, they focused on areas of common value, like how best to collect rainwater, or on making fish hooks. Soon a shift in emphasis began to take place. No one ever said, my camp's traditions are nice, but what really makes the world go around is fishhooks, but they didn't need to say it. They felt it. If you were devout and faithful to your camp's traditions, that garnered favor within your camp, but having a lot of fishhooks in your belt had currency with people from every camp. A day came when one young man discovered a better and easier way to make fishhooks. He made an enormous pile of them, and puncture wounds notwithstanding, he lounged on it like a throne. This image of power and wealth, combined with the extravagant lifestyle it afforded him, led to many young people leaving behind the escape and rescue traditions and fully embracing the values of status and material advantage on the island. This was a new camp, the fishhook camp. If it doesn't make fishhooks, it doesn't make sense, they would say. So the old rescue camp traditions continue to wane, and the newer common culture grows. They're all still on the island. Perhaps they will live there ever after. But happily ever after? I'm not so sure. In The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge, Dallas Willard laments that a broadly Judeo-Christian public moral knowledge has passed away. One significant factor in accounting for this disappearance is the concerted efforts of secular activist intellectuals throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The sociologist Christian Smith makes this case in the first couple of chapters of his book, The Secular Revolution. This is relevant to the loss of moral knowledge in that the moral knowledge was at that time distinctly religious. Therefore, secularization undermined it. However, it seems to me that the intellectual and institutional changes these activists brought about in American universities are inadequate to fully explain the change in the zeitgeist. This is a difficult matter to assess empirically, and I'm not aware of good studies examining it. I'm sure some of you are. Please let me know. I'm curious. Part of the problem lies in how best to understand and operationalize secularization. Proxies such as church attendance may misfire since churches themselves may secularize, as witnessed in the mainline Protestant denominations. But the observation is that religious belief has declined throughout the West over the last couple of hundred years, rather pervasively, regardless of exposure to higher education. That's what I think is interesting here. Even without the influence of anti-religious professors and arguments, people have found the Christian religion and its associated morality less and less compelling. Our question then is this: what kind of phenomenon could have the reach necessary to change hearts and minds far outside the self-conscious critiques of the academy? And by what mechanism? The answer, to some significant extent, as I will attempt to explain, is that the contemporaneous social changes distinctive of modernity have fostered a different way of experiencing the world. This has been a primary driver in the process of secularization, the disenchantment of the world, and in the plausibility of philosophical naturalism. I'm not going to talk about any of that. That's a posit. Just throw that out there. This explains everything, but I'm not going to tell you how. But more importantly for our purposes here, it has made traditional religious morality harder to see and to accept. My approach is to describe three distinctive modern social phenomena and show how they interact so as to bring about a focal shift away from the older Judeo-Christian morality. The three phenomena are pluralism, political liberalism, and urbanization. I understand pluralism in a society as there being multiple distinct perspectives on morality and social order, each with a group of people that to some significant extent occupies that perspective. I say perspectives, but perhaps I should say life worlds or cultures, for I have in mind fairly comprehensive understandings that often run deeper than conscious understanding and include non-cognitive elements such as our dispositions toward values and our manner of interpreting reality. These perspectives inevitably manifest differences in values, differences in what is regarded as good and bad, right and wrong, and as revealed in how people behave and how society should be ordered. And typically, these differing perspectives are rooted in robust traditions. In the wars of religion in Western Europe in the 17th century, the salient perspectives were defined by religious traditions: Roman Catholics versus the Lutherans versus the Calvinists. In the US in the 19th century, it was primarily Protestants versus Roman Catholics. In the 20th century and on down to the present, the key dividing lines have shifted. Although there are still Catholics and Protestants and they still disagree on some core values, but not always, other more significant contrasting perspectives have emerged. Atheism and the so-called nones, those who self-identify as non-religious, have become more common. And the key divide is often between those who take religious authority seriously and those who look to other authorities. Some now occupy a perspective on which social justice for women and minority races is taken to be the primary ethical value. Furthermore, in the last few years, there's a growing divide between the ethos of urban elites and that of non-urban provincial types. So along a number of axes, we have multiple different views of what's important and how we should order our common life. Additionally, we live in a politically liberal society. By that I mean that we presume the importance of the values of individuals concerning how society should be ordered. And the political system is designed to factor in the decisions of individuals through voting, coalition building, and elected representatives. But because of pluralism, we don't all agree. So support and acceptance for elements of social order only comes when there's enough common support. The space of public discourse, largely fostered today by media of various kinds, is where we present our beliefs and values and attempt to bring others to our perspective in order that that perspective might influence the norms for our life together. We can visualize this interplay with a Venn diagram depicting different cultural systems and indicating common elements with overlap. And in my mind, there's going to be a chalkboard, but I should have made handouts. Maybe you can see kind of the classic clover leaf. This is not the Trinity symbol. These are different deep cultures that
just
overlap.
Hand it around like I did.
I thought about it, but there's too much other text on it. I had to follow it around, reading as we looked at it. Reasons and values, you can take your coffee cup and just like mash it on the napkin 3 times. Reasons and values held in common are meant to provide a stable basis for social order in a pluralist, liberal society. This is basically drawn from John Rawls' idea of overlapping consensus. The usual idea of an overlapping consensus is that there are these different coherent moral perspectives, each with its own deep and unique and usually traditional roots. But where these perspectives overlap, different groups can push for the same issues because they agree on them, even though the reasons they might agree on these issues are different based on where the roots lie. This Rawlsian cloverleaf model is, I think, descriptively accurate at some level. The trouble is that the reality that underlies the model is changing in ways that make the model less and less accurate. The cloverleaf diagram presumes that the particular traditions are stable and that individuals tend to remain in the traditions in which they find themselves. But for a number of reasons, this is often not the case. One of the most influential factors here appears to be urbanization. This is probably familiar to most of us. What has happened in the process of urbanization is economic opportunities have drawn people away from village communities of family and friends, where a particular tradition likely tended to predominate. This was intensified in the Industrial Revolution and Agricultural Revolution. Small farmers couldn't compete with mechanized farming techniques, had to find new work. New factories provided this, so people uprooted and flocked to industrial areas, which grew into or added to existing cities. Since then, labor has shifted again away from factories to retail and management and information work in bureaucratic institutions, but the pull toward cities persists. As a result of these factors, urbanization has had a disembedding effect. People leave their home traditions behind and are poured with millions of other uprooted people into new circumstances. The addition of pluralism intensifies this disembedding effect as the new proximity to many from other life worlds further weakens the ties between individuals and their former views and values. Industrial labor doesn't play the role that it once did, but the disembedding process continues due to the role played by the internet. Increasingly, we don't live in villages or even cities so much as we live in non-geographical virtual spaces. Maybe put scare quotes around live, but I think you'll get the idea. That's where we spend a lot of time in an attentional sense. People no longer have to leave a local community to find non-local work, to encounter other life worlds, to associate with others from very different cultures. The internet appears to function like a global city in which anyone with an internet connection may live at any time, no matter where they are physically. Hence, the ever-expanding role of the internet appears to maintain and perhaps intensify the disembedding effects of untraditional values. Each of these 3 distinctive modern social factors can, by itself, function so as to weaken one's embeddedness in a home tradition. Pluralism, because the mere encounter with otherwise intelligent people who disagree with you on deep matters of value can be destabilizing. Liberalism, because a political system designed to take seriously individual belief and value, likewise is an ideal breeding ground for difference and heterodoxy. And the uprooting, dislocating effects of urbanization would appear only to weaken the basis of one's traditional perspective. But putting them all together results in a particularly potent brew. Urbanization pulls people out of like-minded community and in a pluralist society surrounds them with people who disagree with them, which, given classically liberal political norms, requires confrontation and contestation with these competing visions of order and morality. The result, this is an extreme statement, but I think I believe it, the result is an undesigned divide and conquer dynamic, where anyone with deep particular values is systematically culled from their home flock and deprogrammed. That's how it seems to work. The upshot of all this is that disembedding, whether due to urbanization or the social effects of the internet, shrinks the leaves of our cloverleaf model. The exposure to and interaction with different life worlds doesn't just restrict the extent to which values are held in common, but it undermines the home life worlds, the roots, so to speak, of those involved. The cloverleaf model is misleading in another way, for it suggests that the life worlds, the cultures and systems of values, are independent of the overlap. But there's good reason to think that this area of overlap has given rise to its own life world. It has become its own culture. So think of that intersecting bit. You know, in the cloverleaf model, that's just contingent happenstance of overlap of values. As suggested by our opening parable, this new culture in the overlap region is centered around lowest common denominator values, as I will call them, or LCD values. Hence, this region would be better represented as the central disk of a daisy than as a region of overlapping leaves. Like it has some of its own kind of autonomy, so to speak, if I'm right. In order to understand this culture of lowest common denominator values, I want to just briefly discuss different ways in which values can be shared. I kind of nerd out and do some like philosophical taxonomy. I'm going to briskly move through that, but you know, shared values can be essential or accidental based on what cultures happen to exist. But within the essentially shared values, there's two main kinds, I think. There's sort of vital values, things related to health, what you need to stay alive. Everyone agrees on those things. But then another subcategory of the essentially shared values are what I'll call instrumental values. Especially significant for our purposes here, these shared values include things that have value because they serve as the general means that enable us to achieve our ends, whatever those ends might be. Regardless of what you take to be your ultimate goals, there are some cultural tools that enable you better to pursue those ends. These include money, status, and of course, technology. What makes LCD culture different from most other cultures, from the petals of the daisy, is that it takes vital human needs and instrumental power to be the most important values. Human needs and instrumental power, of course, have utility in every culture, but for many, perhaps all other cultures, the most important things lie elsewhere: family unity, national identity, religious practices, and so forth. Traditional cultures overlap with everyone else on the utility of instrumental values, but LCD culture puts disproportionate emphasis on them. Oversimplifying a little bit for sake of clarity, we might say that what makes LCD culture distinctive is that it treats instrumental values as fundamental values. I think we were forced to this conclusion by observing the role that ostensibly instrumental values play in society. Recall that our initial definition of instrumental values was that they were valuable only insofar as they functioned as a good means to the ends, our fundamental values. But now, consider a young person making his way in the world today. At many crucial junctures, he must decide between pursuit of the fundamental values of his traditional home culture and the ostensibly instrumental values. For instance, the fundamental values of his traditional culture might direct him to remain close to home once he reaches adulthood, to work in the family business, to remain in his faith community, to live near parents and siblings. If he is encouraged to go to college, it might be to receive a religious education. Money is, of course, necessary to live, and so employment prospects are never out of mind, but the overall telos of this guidance is to maintain certain values intrinsic to his home culture. On the other hand, there is now a conventional wisdom directing him along a very different path. This wisdom instructs him to go to the best possible schools and might require relocation of his family to ensure that this can happen. Attending college goes without saying, and the goal is for him to go to the most prestigious school he can get into. Upon graduation, the next step is to continue education or certification along the most prestigious path accessible, and eventually to pursue jobs that best maximize income and status, wherever in the world these might be. By the lights of this alternative value system, choosing to remain in one's hometown or choosing a less prestigious school because of its religious affiliation will be seen as irrational. You'd be making some kind of practical mistake. Whatever the alleged underlying justification for this conventional wisdom, this alternative system routinely counsels pursuit of instrumental value over traditional fundamental value, which of course is exactly what we should expect if there were a coherent culture that had valorized formerly instrumental values as fundamental values. I do want to note that LCD culture doesn't necessarily exclude truly fundamental or intrinsic values. Friendship, community, family, love, the beauty of nature, good food, knowing God, all of these really do have fundamental value in themselves and not merely instrumentally. Members of LCD culture do not necessarily reject all these things. Far from it, I would argue that as human beings, we're all helplessly drawn toward these phenomena at some level. It's just that in LCD culture, these intrinsically valuable things are not valued as much as the instrumentally valuable things. LCD culture is sort of an inversion of the order of instrumental to fundamental values. How did LCD culture come about? What is its origin story, and from what does it draw its life? The answer, I believe, is that LCD culture has a certain sort of competitive advantage, a kind of economic superiority over alternative cultures. One way to appreciate this phenomenon is as a matter of supply and demand, taken in a loose sense. In a pluralist society, no culture remains cordoned off from all the others. I draw my deepest values from my home culture and you from yours, but we interact with each other via public institutions like business, medicine, education, politics, and so forth. In these common interactions, we share the instrumental values and perhaps little else. This means while our deep values are in demand in contexts where others share them, the instrumental values are in demand in all contexts. It's not that nothing else matters, but instrumental values will always matter in any context, whereas fundamental values may or may not. So there's a clear sense in which the demand for instrumental values outstrips that for the various culturally distinctive fundamental values. Instrumental values literally have greater currency than do these other values. So this creates conditions especially favorable to the acceptance and entrenchment of LCD culture. It's fishhooks over raft building. Additionally, LCD values confer a material advantage on those who take them as ultimate, or at least as overriding. Rita Koganzin, a theorist of politics and education, describes what I'm calling LCD culture in this way, saying, its conception of autonomy as open-ended choosing elevates the secular, upwardly mobile professional who can succeed in a globalized economy. Such people appear maximally autonomous because they have access to the greatest number of lifestyle choices available in contemporary America. Among the greatest variety of careers, hobbies, friends, and potential spouses, residences, and consumer goods. Nothing is sort of tying them down and keeping them from the whole menu. A successful education for an open future is actually an education for this particular kind of professional future. And that's the end of the quote from Koganzin. Crucially, a member of LCD culture enjoys this greater latitude in life choices because he prioritizes LCD values over those of any traditional culture. As such, LCD culture displays a practical logic of action. Pursue those things that have most currency because that is a materially winning strategy. But there's a third factor that may be even more influential. And I think I had not noticed this before, but Aaron referenced a footnote from Dallas Willard where he talks about conformity, and this is, I'll be drawing on that kind of idea here. Efficiency and material gain definitely motivate human behavior, but the desire to conform may be even more potent. A bit of autobiography may help illustrate. When I was a child, I was homeschooled. As such, I was seldom in contact, let alone a community, with most school children my age. Consequently, I didn't know or care about current clothing fashion. I wore whatever my mother purchased for me. She actually would buy matching outfits for my dad and I because we were the same size by the time I was 13. So it was a scene. Twins. Sometimes playmates in my neighborhood would comment on my strange attire. Paul, why are you wearing low-top sneakers with knee socks? You're supposed to wear high-top basketball shoes with low socks. I would then report that I didn't care, and to emphasize this, I would pull my knee socks up even higher. But a few years later, in high school, I began to attend a large youth group. Almost immediately, my feelings about clothing underwent a sudden shift. I soon found myself at the mall, in the American Eagle store, buying cargo pants and pre-distressed t-shirts. What had happened? Put simply, I conformed to popular norms. There wasn't anything intrinsically aesthetically superior about American Eagle merchandise that motivated me to pursue it. It was merely that everybody was doing it, and I desired to fit in. This is how conformity typically works. We might wonder what effect conformity could have, given that, as we've already seen, LCD values are, in a sense, shared by all. Hence, the effect I'm thinking of isn't found in whether or not people have or pursue LCD values. It's we all value money and technology to some degree. Rather, the effect is revealed in what we might call fundamental choice points. A fundamental choice point is a situation in which someone must choose between a fundamental value according to their traditional culture, on the one hand, or on the other hand, pursuing an instrumental value instead. So, for instance, does one choose a job or career that will enable them to live near their extended family? Or does one choose the job or career that maximizes income or career opportunities? Does one choose to dedicate relatively more time to having a large family? Or does one choose to dedicate one's time to professional goals? Does one give greater precedence to faithfulness to one's local church community or to climbing the ladder, wherever it may lead? You get the idea. These are decisions that reveal what people value, and I assert very commonly, the conventional wisdom indicates that the correct choice is to pursue LCD values over those of one's home culture. Why? Because after this process is up and running, that's at least what most people do. Ideas have consequences, but perhaps not as often as philosophers would like to think. Both Max Weber and Max Scheler argued that ideas have consequences only when human interests can make use of them. This model, which Weber calls an elective affinity, exists between certain ideas and certain interests, and it resembles natural selection in some respects. In natural selection, many organisms come forth, but only those selected by nature survive to reproduction. Similarly, in the case of an elective affinity, many ideas come forth, but only those selected by human interests survive to reproduction, i.e. to endorsement in texts and institutions. An elective affinity is a way of conceptualizing how interests select ideas for salience. I think something similar happens in the realm of phenomenology. And I'm now walking on a very thin ice, so yeah, I look forward to learning from the wisdom of the actual phenomenologist here. But something similar, I think, happens in the realm of phenomenology. For it seems that, in general, values play an important role in highlighting the potential objects of our attention. The realm of potential experience is vast, populated with millions of candidate objects of attention. But we can't pay attention to everything, so how do we decide what to pay attention to? Typically, it seems, we do not decide. Rather, our objects of attention are selected by what we value, what we care about. To paraphrase one of my favorite teachers, where your treasure is, there your eyes will be also. Or to put even more starkly, only what is valued is really seen. This is a claim about human psychology, but one that strikes me as being verified by even the most casual observation. My wife loves to golf and notices golf courses whenever we're out driving. To me, it's just more real estate. I notice if she draws attention to them, but otherwise I wouldn't see them. Again, as a strange homeschool child, I was obsessed with herpetology, and I would see frogs and lizards when we were out walking. Other people didn't care and didn't notice. The ramifications of LCD culture for phenomenology should now be coming into focus. As the instrumental values valorized by LCD culture gain acceptance, instrumentally valuable things dominate our moral field of vision. Importantly, this is almost completely pre-reflective, I would say, taking place at the level of experience, at the level of how the world seems to us. This helps explain why people who are intellectually committed to deep and fundamental values, say a church-going Christian who believes himself to be committed to God, church, and family, may nevertheless make frequent and momentous choices indicating that he, in fact, more highly values his credentials and career. The apparent value of credentials and career is buoyed by his basic experience of the world, which insulates them from revision by his convictions. And I put myself in this category, so I don't. This sounds judgmental, but I'm talking to myself here. I'm like writing this paper is like, oh, I've done all of those things. It's unfortunate. It has been said that the power of culture is directly proportional to the extent to which it is taken for granted. I think this is what we see in the influence of LCD culture upon our phenomenology. Wrapping up, I'm going to make a few modest proposals. My argument has been that in a pluralistic society, common culture encodes and instills goals that highlight instrumental values and which make fundamental values harder to notice. This has been influential in bringing about the replacement of an older Judeo-Christian morality by a new liberal, meritocratic, what I'm calling lowest common denominator morality. In light of this, what can be done to turn the tide, to strengthen what remains, or at least to kindle a guttering flame in one's own home? I don't suppose we should opt out of the engines of this common culture, even if we could. Perhaps we could lessen its sway on ourselves and on our immediate families by staying out of urban areas, avoiding political interaction with those of different fundamental values, and staying off the internet. This is all easier said than done, and would probably require building something like the insular and intentionally anachronistic community in M. Night Shyamalan's movie, The Village. It's weird to watch that movie now for me, as opposed to when it first came out. I'm like, oh, they're doing a good thing. But this, it seems to me, would require withholding love from our neighbors in pursuit of a greater moral clarity, an enterprise that seems destined for self-defeat. And it certainly doesn't appear to be a way of going into the world and making disciples of all men. Short of withdrawing from the world, then, what might we do? I have two very small suggestions, though neither of which I think offers any hope of reversing the civilizational course. First, while I think total cultural withdrawal is not an option for Christians, there may be half measures here that could help. I'm thinking particularly of moral education in the home. In all likelihood, our children first encounter the engines of the Zeitgeist in school, where they are exposed to life worlds different from their own, and dialogue with children and teachers from these other life worlds. Childhood is the most influential time in the development of a person's moral perspective, so it stands to reason that this would be an especially critical time to form our children away from these influences. Theoretically, the effects of pluralistic liberalism should be weaker in a confessional school, in a Christian school. However, LCD values nevertheless often predominate here as well via superficially morally neutral meritocratic values, encoded as academic excellence. If a school culture is focused on academic achievement, GPAs, SAT scores, acceptance to prestigious universities, then Christian ethics may be displaced without being explicitly controverted. There may be required courses in theology and a daily chapel program, but if the school's culture is one where academic achievement determines status, then the commitment to Christian ethics may be merely notional. To put it baldly, such schools inadvertently teach children that it's more important to get good grades than to love God and their neighbor. Homeschooling in healthy Christian schools may not be achievable for all of us, but they do offer our children an incubation stage, wherein Christian ethics can be taught and has a better chance of taking root. My second suggestion is that we learn to cultivate what we might call the opposite of mindfulness. Let me explain. By way of another film. Some of us have perhaps seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, the Hollywood retelling of the life of mathematician John Nash. Nash basically invented game theory in mathematics, but what makes his life particularly dramatic is his lifelong struggle with schizophrenia. At its worst, he would not only hear voices, but hallucinate entire relationships with imaginary people. Eventually, he became persuaded that these were illusions, even though they seemed real to him. He learned to consciously and effortfully ignore the hallucinations, to look past the phantasms and focus instead on the real world. The phenomenology of lowest common denominator culture poses a similar problem. It presents us with a distracting and illusory world. As with any culture, the power of LCD culture is strengthened to the extent that it's not recognized as culture, but is instead taken for granted as the nature of reality. But if we can come to realize that the denuded, deracinated world of fundamentalized instrumental value is illusory, then perhaps we can try to walk in Nash's shoes. We can begin to consciously, effortfully discount the illusions of LCD culture and bring back into focus our obligations to family and neighbor and the true value of human and divine love. Perhaps we can reach beyond fishhooks and become instead fishers of men.
It's a real honor and pleasure to be here, so thank you for having me. I'm trained as a historian among philosophers here, so you've probably heard of the phrase like a fox in the hen house. I feel a little bit, like a hen in the fox den here with all you philosophers. In reading Dallas Willard and Dietrich von Hildebrand, and not least Paul Nedelisky, I have the feeling of being in the presence of distinguished, searching minds grappling with matters of first-order significance and considerable complexity. Now, a commentator's job, of course, is to provoke conversation, often by disagreement. But like Aaron yesterday, I found this to be quite challenging because I found myself in sympathy with so much that Paul had to say. So let me first highlight a few things that I think Paul did well before I try to kick the hornet's nest nonetheless. Just a little bit. I found the opening parable both delightful and instructive, helping make the distinction between fundamental goods and instrumental goods, and how our late modern society often mistakes the former for the latter. To a significant degree, we do live in a fishhook society, one that mistakes the material means or conditions for living well for the goal, the telos of life itself. Having a good life is mistaking for becoming a good person. I did that when the parable wondered where the plane was going in the first place, trying to get back off. So I thought this might be some meta-teleological realm that Paul can elucidate for us after I speak. I also found myself, by and large, in agreement with Paul that the moral transformation or disembeddings or deracinations that he and Willard and many others have tried to account for are not explained exclusively by intellectual changes alone, what eggheads say or do in the academy or in print, but are more pervasively rooted in modernity itself, and yes, perhaps particularly in the three dominant socioculture forces that Paul has highlighted: pluralism, political liberalism, and urbanization. Put differently, I imagine few grandmothers wake up in a cold sweat worrying about how non-cognitive ethical theory might affect the grandchildren. But they probably do worry, and rightly so, when the grandkids move away to the big city. I mean, if you have grandmothers educated in modern philosophy, I could stand corrected on this one, and they probably should worry about that as well. Finally, I found Paul's discussion of fundamental choice points illuminating. Even as many today still subscribe to older moral and religious traditions, their decisions at important junctures in their life, choosing a college, taking a job, deciding where to live, reveal what people actually value, and often is the instrumental or the LCD values, as he says, earning more, climbing the ladder, getting on in the world. And we've all probably felt the bite of these decisions in our personal lives and in our family's life. I could sing his praises still further, but let me pivot now and try to kick the hornet's nest a bit. In 4 points. In reading Paul and Willard, one gets the sense that the prose is marching headlong toward a fundamental indictment of modernity. And to be sure, there is much about the world of late modernity that deserves indicting. But I wonder if Jacques Maritime's observation that most constellations of human thought and culture are complexly marbled, containing both good and bad elements. The philosopher Ralph McInerney once described this as Maritime's propensity, before launching into cultural critique, to seek out what he calls the lurking good in things. Recognize that the imago Dei can never be fully effaced in any given cultural formation. Warped, perhaps, but not effaced. Are there things, then, in the world of fishhooks and about the forms of human creativity, risk-taking, ingenuity that it encourages, about the possibilities of amelioration of suffering and want that it encourages, that at least deserve one or perhaps two cheers of approbation? What are they? From another angle, can at least some instrumental goods be redescribed as workaday bourgeois virtues and extolled, so long as they remain subserviently ordered to deeper fundamental goods? Point 2, and here I'm sort of putting on my historian's hat, which someone told me I should really get one of these. I say that phrase enough, well, I'm going to get the hat and just pull it out and say, okay, the historian. how precisely do the forces that Paul has identified, pluralism, urbanization, and liberalism, do their work, particularly when there might be episodes in human history where at least some of the same forces did not promote the type of moral deracination that characterizes our own time. Due to an upsurge in evangelical revivalism and piety, for example, historians have shown that despite enormous processes of industrialization and urbanization, Victorian Britain became, in some ways, more tradition-oriented and pious place in the course of the 19th century. The more fundamental patterns of secularization only emerging in the post-World War II era. Furthermore, there are examples of many examples of pluralistic urban centers in human history. Ancient Alexandria, medieval Baghdad, many trading cities along the Silk Road that did not necessarily result in the disappearance of moral knowledge as Willard or Paul might understand it. So perhaps then modern political liberalism is the primary culprit. Or perhaps there are other forces that we should consider, or a combination of intellectual forces and broader social ones, specifically market forces, consumerism, quasi-psychological ones, what Philip Reef once called the triumph of the therapeutic, philosophical naturalism, which was mentioned, or perhaps globalization as encouraging a qualitatively different type of pluralism today. Point number 3, finally, or not finally, one more point. Let me raise the question about Paul's assertion that Willard was only partially correct. An earlier, broadly Judeo-Christian public morality was and is lost, he writes, agreeing with Willard. However, continuing a quote, this former public moral knowledge has been largely replaced by a new one, variously called neoliberalism or meritocratic culture. Now, this type of analysis, asserting that modernity does not just deracinate, but also assert successor, ersatz, or replacement moral systems, has a venerable pedigree, going back at least as far as Alexis de Tocqueville's analysis of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. But I wonder if morality is too strong a word to apply here. What if instead of morality, we might do better to speak of a regnant milieu, or temper, or mood, but one that in turn has spawned various moral reactions to it. And certainly there might be others, but I would at least posit 2, what I would call social justiceism, as a mop to conscience, especially among high flyers in the global economy, those who have most benefited from meritocratic culture, but feel a tinge of guilt about it. And this, Willard mentions this when he talks about, a lot of morality being, holding the right political or social views. And this might be a type of, we could quibble about this, more kind of political orientation or exhibitionism than morality in any deeply ingrained sense. But we also might speak of populist neo-traditionalism, stemming from those often on the lower rungs of the global socioeconomic order, who, disquieted by and often deleteriously affected by the deracinating forces of modernity, seek the vigorous reassertion of an older moral order, or at least some fragments of it, but they do so in a social and political context more given to the will to power than to conditions actually conducive to reversing the disembedding process in any meaningful way. Finally, while I applaud the impulses behind Paul's conclusion, some modest proposals, I wonder if there's a slight misstep in pitting withdrawal from the world in search of a greater moral clarity against loving our neighbors while resolving to stay in the world. Now here, of course, we stumble upon the ongoing conflict between boosters of the Benedict option versus those resolved to be in the world but not of it, come what may. I would only ask here in conclusion if these are only 2 options, and might we do better to distinguish what I'm going to call A, reclusive Benedict option, concerned only about sectarian moral purity on the one hand, or B, what I'm going to call an inviting Benedict option, a more prudential, porous withdrawal that is ultimately for the sake of the world and for love of the neighbor. Now, Paul's closing prescriptions actually suggest that this might be the case in his own mind, so let me simply abruptly conclude here, lest efforts of provocation willy-nilly lapse back into nodding agreement with this very fine and very subtle essay. Thank you.
All right, we've got time